Russia slips into default sector as price cutoff date expires. London. Russia looked set for its first sovereign default in many years as some bondholders mentioned that they had not obtained past due hobby on Monday following the expiry of a key price deadline an afternoon earlier. Russia has struggled to preserve up payments on $40 billion of outstanding bonds considering the fact that its invasion of Ukraine on February 24, as sweeping sanctions have effectively cut the United States off from the worldwide economic device and rendered its assets untouchable to many traders. The Kremlin has again and again mentioned there are not any grounds for Russia to default. However, it's far unable to send cash to bondholders because of sanctions, accusing the West of looking to power it into a synthetic default. Russia's efforts to keep away from what might be its first main default on international bonds for the reason that Bolshevik revolution greater than a century ago hit an insurmountable roadblock in past due May, whilst the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control (OFAC) effectively blocked Moscow from making bills. Since March, the idea that a Russian default might be inevitable, and the query became just when. Denis Ranitsky, head of sovereign litigation at law corporation Quinn Emanuel, informed. OFAC has intervened to answer that question for us, and the default is now upon us. While a formal default might be largely symbolic given Russia cannot borrow across the world in the interim and doesn't need to because of ample oil and gas export revenues, the stigma might possibly improve its borrowing costs in destiny. The bills in question are $100 million in hobby on two bonds, one denominated in US dollars and some other in euros. Russia become because of pay on May 27. The bills had a grace period of 30 days, which expired on Sunday. Russia's finance ministry said it made the payments to its onshore National Settlement Depository (NSD) in euros and greenbacks, adding it has fulfilled responsibilities. Some Taiwanese holders of the bonds had not received bills on Monday, resources informed. For many bondholders, not receiving the money owed in time into their bills constitutes a default. With no genuine cutoff date special within the prospectus, attorneys say Russia may have until the quit of the subsequent business day to pay the bondholders. Small print. The legal state of affairs surrounding the bonds appears complicated. Russia's bonds have been issued with an unusual sort of phrases, and an increasing degree of ambiguities for those bought greater these days, whilst Moscow changed into already going through sanctions over its annexation of Crimea in 2014 and a poisoning incident in Britain in 2018. Rodrigo Olivares Caminal, chair in Banking and Finance Law at Queen Mary University in London, mentioned clarity was needed on what constituted a discharge for Russia on its obligation, or the difference between receiving and recuperating payments. All these problems are challenged to interpretation by way of a court docket of regulation. However, Russia has not waived any of its sovereign immunity and has not submitted to the jurisdiction of any courtroom in any of the two prospectuses, Olivares Caminal advised. In some methods, Russia is in default already. A committee on derivatives has dominated a credit event had occurred on some of its securities, which triggered a payout on a number of Russia's credit default swaps devices used by investors to ensure exposure to debt towards default. This changed into prompted by Russia failing to make a $1.9 million charge in accrued hobby on a fee that had been due in early April. Until the Ukraine invasion, a sovereign default had regarded unthinkable, with Russia being rated investment grade up to shortly earlier than that point. A default could additionally be unusual as Moscow has the finances to service its debt. The OFAC had issued a temporary waiver, known as a General License 9A, in early March to permit Moscow to hold paying investors. It permitted expire on May 25 as Washington tightened sanctions on Russia, correctly slicing off payments to U.S.